I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I think this is a fabulous event, not before time, I should say, and I think there are a few reasons for that, many of which have been touched on today. I think the first is just the sheer scale of the trading relationships that we have in food. I think everyone in Ireland recognises the size of the trading relationship and the exporting base that we have into the UK, but it's actually much less known that Ireland is actually the biggest food exporting country for Britain. And it's that two-way scale that makes this topic, I think, so important. I think the second reason that it's today's session and what flows from it is so apt is the global trends that are going on in food. This is undoubtedly, whether we're able to capitalize it on or not, one of the growth areas of the global economy for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, where the demographics in terms of population growth and in terms of the size of the emerging middle class in Asia are going to make food and value-added food enormous growth sectors, while at the same time putting enormous pressures around sustainability and land use and lots of really tricky philosophical debates in terms of where science can play in facilitating all of that. And I think that the third reason, which again, we live every day in our business as to why I think there's opportunity in this space, is that the skills that we have in Ireland and the skills that we have in Britain are actually different and quite complementary, and I think there's a really, really live opportunity actually to put them together and drive growth in third countries, not just in the developing world, but also in other developed world countries as well, and I'll touch on that in a while. So what I thought I would do is cover two topics, if I may. The first is how we think about what the big themes for innovation are likely to be over the next 20 years. Some of them are nuanced and reflect our own experience in Greencore, and some of them I think might be a slightly different slant on themes that have been discussed already today. And then I wanted to talk quite specifically actually from where I stand about what some of the near-term and longer-term areas of collaboration might look like as we go forward between Britain and Ireland, and what we as industry participants can do against each of those. The first theme I wanted to talk about was the theme of value. I think in all the understandable desire to talk about value add, to talk about specialist brands, to talk about premium brands, people lose sight of the fact that for the vast, vast majority of the human race, value is the most important criteria when selecting food. And that is not just a developing market phenomenon, it's a developed market phenomenon as well. And it's become more so. So if you look over the last 5 years in Britain, for example, you've moved from about 38% of consumers that actively shopped for promotional deals to over 50% of consumers shopping for them today. Shopping behavior has changed around that area. Let me give you one sort of anecdote and one harder piece of data there. One of the biggest growth areas in UK retailing today is cash dispensing. The reason for that is that for shoppers who are shopping on a budget, the only way they can hold themselves to account with that budget is by going to the cash point first, taking out £40 or £50, and that is all they spend. And that is the world for so many of the consumers of our products, and for so many of the products that many of us manufacture, and many of us will innovate to keep manufacturing as we go forward. The second change that's driven by consumers' desire for value, and this is paradoxical actually, is that consumers are shopping more now than ever before. They're shopping more frequently, they're shopping in more formats, and that's partly because the only way they can convince themselves that they're getting access to the best value is by doing it themselves. So you're seeing a proliferation of smaller stores, more specialist store formats, be that discounters, online shopping, and so forth. And again, it's consistent with consumers themselves hunting out value offerings going forward. So that's the world in which, that's where the developed markets are. We may wish it to be different, but that's where it is. And as we think about innovation priorities, we have to drive product innovation that delivers to that value needs. And that set of needs that many, many shoppers and consumers have. That's a big priority for us. As a business, we we have somewhere between 40 and 50% of our revenues every year are in products that we innovate that year. Right? That's the scale of the refreshment of our products that we drive in order to capitalize and change to the needs of our shoppers. The second theme I wanted to touch on was convenience. The big sort of insight that we think we have here is that actually what people are consuming is not changing very much, but how they're consuming it and how they're buying it is changing rapidly. And a lot of the focus of innovation efforts for a business like ours, and we think for the food industry more broadly, would be facilitating changing meal occasions for consumers at home and changing shopping behavior for consumers when they go to access that food. And again, let me give you a couple of examples about that. The first actually is there is a caricature of human consumption that is focused around a daily family meal, typically between 5 and 7 in the evening. If you actually take a long-term historic view on that, there's only been about 25 to 30 years in human history where that has been a common consumption occasion. It flowed on roughly from the end of the Second World War up until about 1980 or so. So the proliferation of meal occasions now in some ways is actually a return to the fact that consumers for years and years, centuries and centuries, chose to eat in a much more fragmented way than we grew up with in the case of many of us as kids in a stable family situation. And so when we look at what we're trying to do, a big part is trying to find ways of getting product to meet the different meal occasions that consumers want. And so you'll see that. So that's why if you look at all of the forecasts for where food is going to be sold over the next 5 to 10 years, you'll see 30 to 50% growth in convenience stores, 2/3 growth in, and these are all in real terms, in hard discounters, 100% growth in discounting, and you'll see large supermarkets flat in volume going forward. So the way in which that particular format and the role that it played in shopping behavior is changing, and the requirements of those channels in terms of innovation and the type of shelf life that they need, the type of labeling, the type of bundling, the type of promotional support looks and feels very different. The third theme I wanted to talk about is trust. And clearly that's a very topical area in the light of what's happened over the last 4 or 5 months. As we see it, the trust between shoppers and brand owners, be they retailers or manufacturers, has been damaged and damaged quite seriously in the last 4 months. We'd be quite hopeful actually about what can be done to address that. As we talk to consumers, what continues to get played back to us is that this was, in their words, a food scandal and not a food scare. So while they're angry with industry participants, they're not fundamentally afraid of the food. That's helpful when you talk about what's necessary to drive a recovery. But it came about through a coincidence of circumstances. Some of it was the pressure on value. Some of it was, frankly, fraudulent behavior, arbitraging on the difference between protein prices between beef and horse. Some of it came about actually because of what Paul spoke about, the scientific advances running, frankly, ahead of regulation. And some of it came about actually reflecting a pretty serious erosion since 2008 in the trust in all things large, be that large companies, large retailers, large manufacturers, government regulation. If you look at the kind of Edelman-type surveys on this, what you'll see is that increasingly consumers are trusting what's local and what's small and what their friends tell them, and distrusting pretty much everything else. And so that's the context in which this happened. And the consequences have been damaging. You've seen an erosion in consumer trust in brands. You've seen a significant weakening of confidence within the global food supply chain. And you've seen significant volume hits in many, many product areas. And the response to that actually, I think, has been quite impressive. It's not been shouted about very much right now, and I think that's fine, because I think the substance needs to lead the perception in terms of what's being done. But what you're seeing in terms of joined up regulation, particularly at government level, less so unfortunately at regulator level, what you're seeing in terms of changes in the supply chain, the permanent use of testing, changes in manufacturing practice, which is around concentration and narrowing of the customers that are served out of individual sites. And I think what will unfold in terms of packaging, consumer communication, and provenance, which I think is a double-edged sword, I'll touch on that in a second, will all play to rebuild consumer trust over time. And despite the fact that I think this has been severe, it is important to view it in the context of where the food industry sits today. First of all, and I know the Secretary of State touched on this earlier, actually the cumulative outcome of the tests was that this was not a pervasive problem. You were dealing with somewhere between 0.5 and 0.75 of 1% of contaminated product at pretty low levels, and the vast majority actually of the product was perfectly safe and put together in a very, very robust way. The second thing that shouldn't be lost sight of here as well is that never in human history has food been safer, have supply chains been more transparent, and have consumers got what they want at the value points in which they're looking for safely and effectively delivered. So yes, there are some lessons to learn in terms of rebuilding trust, and there is a challenge to rebuild trust, but the foundations I think are in place to enable us to do that. The final theme I just wanted to touch on, which is, and it will be very, very brief, I promise, Jackie, is on the theme of sustainability, and some of the big macro factors that need to underpin food innovation. And I guess my request here, and it was echoed by both ministers, is that we all need, as citizens of Ireland, of Europe, and indeed of the world, we need the best and the brightest people coming out of universities to focus on the macro challenges of the food industry, resource allocation at a macro scale, and balancing the scientific advances that are absolutely necessary and that have underpinned food productivity for 100 years now. We need that to increase rather than to be held back, and we have to confront the philosophical debates that it'll be necessary to have around, and often, to be blunt, that's a debate with people who themselves have no actual empathy for the value needs and the protein needs of the vast majority of the world's population, who require us to find continuous and more efficient ways of driving up yields and driving up protein availability, while at the same time optimizing for climatic shocks and so forth around the world. I think that's going to be very, very important, and it's not easy. So in the context of all of that, I think there are, as we look at it, 4 areas which create real opportunity, but which unaddressed actually create barriers to Ireland and Britain moving forward together in capturing on this opportunity. And I think it is a big opportunity in the global food industry. The first area is around skills and training. Because the challenges are changing all the time, we just need more, and it's a bit cliche to say better, but it's certainly more and different people to come into our industry. So we are the business that the Secretary of State described earlier that has 50 vacancies for food technologists today. We've had that, by the way, for 3 or 4 years. It is really, really hard to fill those roles. But if you come out and you look at the Improve, which is the food and drinks industry or sector skills group, I mean, they would say that of the 9,000 identified food technologist roles in Britain today, 25% of them are currently vacant. That's the scale of the task, and Kieran touched on some of that here. And I think there is there's both a challenge to practically line up those needs as quickly as possible with the education providers. And these are not just the universities. Some of this is vocational skills, some of this is apprenticeships for the 21st century. Some of it is more joined up between retailers and manufacturers rather than just manufacturers. I mean, it requires quite a lot of thought, but there is today a significant gap between the skills that we need and what's currently available in the marketplace, which, given the size of the economic challenges that both of our countries face, is an opportunity and indeed an imperative to address. Very briefly. Yeah. I wanted to touch very briefly on regulation. And I say this, by the way, in the context of the fact that regulation has largely worked for food in Britain and Ireland. You are less likely to die of food poisoning in Britain or Ireland than in any other developed country in the world. and almost 10 times less likely to die of food poisoning than you are in America. So the food safety agencies have done a pretty good job, actually. But it's precisely because of that it is frustrating for multi-country businesses like ours that the FSA and the FSAI are fighting with each other the way they are post the horse meat scandal, and it's frankly an outrage the way in which Alan Riley was treated when he was summoned to and chose to attend the House of Commons Select Committee hearing last month. That shouldn't be happening, and it's not consistent with us being joined up and driving our business forward together. And then the last thing I would say is the opportunities for trade, and I can deal with this in the Q&A, but actually Britain is brilliant at food retailing, and Ireland is very good at food manufacturing. And when we can combine those capabilities in a complementary way, the opportunities for us to build new businesses together in other geographies is very high, and clearly that's what we're trying to do with our convenience store business with 7-Eleven and Starbucks in the United States right now, and I think there's an opportunity to do much more of that. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions on any of that in the Q&A in a few minutes. Thanks, sir.